Alrighty, so how are you going with this series? We're in week 3 of the series which we've based around John chapter 10 and particularly the parable of the Good Shepherd there. And if you've missed the last 2, then you can just go to our website and follow the links to YouTube or the podcast to catch up with it. But if you recall, it was a parable that Jesus told because people were asking who he was, arguing about it, in fact. And if you dip back into chapter 9, the chapter before where the parable is there, you'll see that Jesus had healed a man who'd been blind from birth, and that had provoked a whole pile of questioning and debating. So is Jesus from God or not? Is Jesus a prophet or not? Messiah or not? Or Son of Man, Son of God or not? With the religious leaders of the time landing on the or not every time, but there was debate going on nonetheless in the community. So the parable is just those first 5 verses of chapter 10, which we've looked at every week so far, and that was supposed to explain to the people who Jesus was. But in verse 6, these words are recorded. Those who heard Jesus use this illustration did not understand what he meant. So he explained it to him. 3 times we learned last week, recorded in chapter 10, Jesus explained the parable to them in 3 different sections recorded in John chapter 10. And in each of those sections, he highlighted something about who he is, the Good Shepherd, and something beautiful about what the Jesus life is like, if you were to choose it. I've got those up on a slide now, just very, very short version. These were the characteristics we identified last week. If you choose the Jesus life, there is more certainty. There is less loneliness, less worry, less fear, less anxiety, more security, because no one can snatch you away from Jesus, who is God. And whatever God takes to himself, nobody can take from him. Very short version. You can go to the Do You Want More with that email that we send out each Sunday, or listen to the podcast to get a little bit more about that. But you might have noticed, if you've been following it through in your Bibles or on your device, that there's a whole section starting at about verse 31 that we haven't even looked into at all. And that's what I want to have a look at this week. It's not actually what I'd originally planned to do, but I think it's important that we take one more look at just who Jesus says he is. And I haven't forgotten that I said I would talk about, I think it's verse 16, those other sheep. Remember that? I haven't forgotten that. You can again check out last week's Do You Want More with that, and that'll tell you something about those other sheep, but I will address that, so come along next Sunday if you want to hear about the other sheep. Okay, so we are going to read from verse 31 in just a moment, but I want to give you a bit of context so you can sort of dip into this wised up a little bit. So as far as the chapter goes, the way that it's recorded in the chapter, Jesus has just finished parable explanation 2, in verses 11 to 16, and he makes that awesome claim we read last week in verse 18 about being in charge of his life to the extent that he can lay it down and, I think more significantly, pick it up again. And we've heard that in verse 18. And when we get to verse 19, and from there the passage that we are going to look at today, we've probably actually jumped a month forward in time from the healing of the blind man and the telling of the parable, okay? So it looks like it happened next thing. Probably a month has gone by. But people are still consumed with who Jesus is and what he said about having control over his own life and death and life again. Some of them thought his claims were the result of the fact that he was demon-possessed. You know, he's a lunatic. He's obviously possessed by something, probably a demon. But other people said, well, that seems unlikely. You know, remember a month back? We saw him. We know that blind man. He's been in our community since birth. And we saw that he healed that blind man. And why would a demon do that? How could a demon do that? Okay, so it's probably, if you get this in your mind, late December, winter time. And Jesus was in Jerusalem for the 8-day festival called Hanukkah, or the Festival of Dedication, that celebrated the reclaiming and the rededication of the Jewish temple that had happened back in 164 BCE. See, back then, the temple had become a place of worship for the gods of other nations, but the Jews had won back the temple largely due to the heroism of a man called Judas Maccabeus. As a reward for his bravery, Judas and his family actually got appointed as kings. They became royalty. Now, I know you're thinking, oh, well, the Jews had kings, the Israelites had kings, But the acting of the kings in the community, in the nation's life, had ceased. People will still count down their lineage through the kings. But this was a pretty exciting thing for the Jews, that in a sense they had royalty back again in an active way in that place. And so every time the Jews celebrated this festival on the 25th of December, interestingly, in the middle of winter time in their part of the world, they will remember God liberating them and giving them back the temple as their place of worship. And they were remembering how Jewish people had become kings again, had become royalty again. So think about this. Can you imagine it? Here is Jesus, flesh and blood, who we will learn is God with us, walking through the temple, which had long been a symbol or an actuality of God's presence with his people, during this festival, against a background of public debate that had been going on for some time now about who he is, and with all those claims that he had made to be the good shepherd, a good leader, the king, if you like, who would show up all other leaders for the corrupt people that they were. So all of that, can you imagine that hotbed, as all of that is happening in people, and it's very in front of people's minds. So Jesus, God with us, is walking through the temple, which was the place God was with his people. What an awesome thing. And the people surrounding him asked him, we read in verse 24, "How long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." And Jesus answers with parable explanation 3 that I talked to you about last week, verses 25 to 30 there. And he pretty much says to the people, well, I've already answered that question when I said to you, the Father and I are one. But he says, you didn't hear that because you don't know my voice. Okay, now we can pick up the story in verse 31. The people have heard from him again that he's declaring effectively to be one with God. And once again, the people picked up stones to kill him. And Jesus, rather calmly, I think, said, "At my Father's direction, I have done many good works. So for which one of those good works are you actually going to stone me now?" They replied, we're stoning you not for any good work, but for blasphemy. You, a mere man, claim to be God. Now think on what I said just a moment ago. Jesus is walking through the temple, the place where God was known to be with his people. And here is Jesus who has declared himself one with God. Jesus, who we know to be God with us, God's ultimate presence with us. And the people wanted to kill him for daring to claim equality with God. They couldn't see that the good he had done in their communities was actually the thing that pointed to the fact that he was who he said he was. And maybe it's, to be fair, only from a little bit of distance, certainly from our distance, we can see the irony of this. The one who chose to make himself one of us was accused in that moment for just being one of us. Wow. So Jesus replied, "It is written in your own scriptures that God said to certain leaders of the people, 'I say you are gods.'" So God told some leaders that they were gods. "And you know that the scriptures cannot be altered. So if those people who received God's message were called gods, why do you call it blasphemy when I say I am the Son of God?" Now, that little quote that Jesus was referring to there is from Psalm 82 and verse 6, which says, God's words, "I say you are gods, you are all children of the Most High." And what Jesus is, I'll unpack that a little more later, but what Jesus is highlighting here is that if Israel, or at least some leaders of Israel, could have been referred to as gods in some sense of the word, well then how much more is it right and fitting that he, who is the Son of God, be referred to as God. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. We will go right through to the end of the chapter today, but I want to tell you a story. Some of you who know me well know that I love the commentary, the theological thinking of Bishop Tom Wright. And he tells this story in a commentary that he wrote on this book of John, and I want to share it with you now. It goes like this. A composer died. And as people were going through the paperwork in his place where he lived, they found all sorts of stuff. But they found amongst all his stuff one copy that he'd written out by hand of a manuscript that no one had seen before. And at the top of the manuscript, in the composer's own hand, was written the inscription, "To the City Guild of Violinists." That was an organisation, the City Guild of Violinists. Now, when people from the City Guild of Violinists saw this music, before they'd even tried to play it in any way, they saw that it was extraordinary. Like, I'm sure our band up the front would look at something and know something about what they're looking at on that page before they even play it. They could see by just looking at it that it was very difficult, and some said, sort of half-jokingly, "Can you even play this? It looks unplayable." But they were honoured. The City Guild of Violinists were honoured to have this manuscript given to them. But sometime later, their honour turned to embarrassment because none of them could play the manuscript. And they actually took copies, made copies and sent all the violinists in the guild home with a copy, working on the theory that if you could just practice a little bit more at home, one of us will master it and you'll be able to teach the others how to master this music. But even so, even with copies in their own homes, spending time practicing it, they couldn't master the music. And you know what happened? Inevitably, people involved, the excuses started. I get that. I would have been one of the forerunners probably. Well, how could the composer have expected us to play these notes simultaneously? How's that even physically possible? Clearly, he was old. He must have been starting to lose the sharpness in his mind. It's fairly evident in this piece of composition that he was losing the plot. "Look," someone remarked, "there isn't even an identifiably consistent melody." After a while you see patterns and you go, "Oh, that bit again." There's not even one of those, although there's certainly some interesting passages in there. Still, the guild members agreed that they would keep on practicing. They would keep on trying to learn the piece when they had time. Although someone did wonder out loud if perhaps the old man had never meant for them to be able to play it. Maybe that was the point. It was just a strange and impossible idea. And in time, the music was put aside and forgotten. Years and years later, an old man came into town. He had a scrappy old beard and a battered old violin case. And he moved into a small apartment in the main city square. And it wasn't long before a strange and beautiful music could be heard from his apartment, coming out from his apartment. So members of the City Guild of Violinists gathered under the windows. They listened for a moment or two. That's all it took for them to realise that the man was playing the manuscript that had been dedicated to them. It was indeed almost unplayable, almost, but not quite. And they could hear it. The man was, in fact, playing the music. He was making it dance and leap. It was wild and strange. It was strong and gentle all at once. And they stood there and they listened. And when the man had finished playing, a number of them just burst into applause. They couldn't help it. They just spontaneous applause. But others in the group were angry. "That's our music," someone called out. "Well, who's he to play it? He doesn't even belong to the guild, for heaven's sake. What right has he got to that music? And anyway, what's he trying to do? Is he trying to make us look like idiots?" The man who had played the nearly impossible music heard the commotion outside, and he opened the window and he looked out and he said, "Don't worry, don't worry about it. I'm actually the composer's son. That's why I can play the music. He taught me to play it." "Rubbish! Rubbish!" shouted the people. "That's not possible. That can't possibly be true. You don't belong here. You're making that up. You're not one of us." And the next morning, the violinist had gone, and that city never heard the music again. Do you remember in verse 34, Jesus had replied, "It is written in your own scriptures, your own law, that God said to certain leaders of the people, "I say you are gods." And he was referencing Psalm 82. And back there at the time that was referenced in the Psalms, God was warning the leaders of the time that although he had made them gods, although they had been given special status as God's own people, given the special status that went with being given the law, which was God's own word given directly to them, in spite of being called gods, they had not lived up to the privilege and the responsibility. So the psalm reads like this: "I say you are gods, you are all children of the Most High, but you will die like mere mortals and fall like every other ruler." So using the analogy that Tom Wright provides with that story of the composer, it's as if the people had been given some music, but they couldn't play it. Then all those generations later, Jesus turns up and plays the music, but instead of celebrating, the people, particularly the leaders, some of the leaders, they are devastated. They're horrified, as if over time the fact that they couldn't play the music had become the law. The music is unplayable. We can't play it. The music is unplayable. It's impossible to play this music. That had become their truth. No one can play this song. So can you see what happened here? I've been talking over the last few weeks about choice, thief life, Jesus life, mediocre, the norm we settle for, or what it is that Jesus offers us. Can you see how the people had settled for what had become their norm? Settled for the mediocre. And because of that, they were actually prepared to defend the fact that the music was unplayable at any cost. That had become their law, their truth. And can you see, in terms of the language that I've used over these last couple of weeks, how they had stopped guarding what was precious. And what was precious for the nation that God had chosen and made was their unique relationship with God. They had stopped guarding that. Remember, I said the thief doesn't come with menaces bounding on your door. The thief sneaks in and just quietly takes away what you're not guarding. And they hadn't guarded that most precious thing, that they were a people defined by their relationship with God. Can you see the way they let themselves be robbed of that priceless relationship? And instead of being the people to herald Jesus as the one they had waited for, they were the people who said it is not possible that he could be the one who he says he is. Not possible with his words, not possible even through his actions. Now, in the book, Tom Wright's book, after he tells that story, he makes this comment. He says, "It's as if the composer knew all along that the Son would one day come and play the music, and that if it was to be appreciated, others had first to try and fail." They wouldn't like that. We wouldn't like that. But that too would be part of the plan, part of the music. And in the middle of it all, the Son would be saying to them, "Don't you see? The Father is present in me, and I am in the Father." Let's go on. "After all," says Jesus, "the Father set me apart and sent me into the world. Don't believe me unless I carry out my Father's work. But if I do his work, believe in the evidence of the miraculous works I have done, even if you don't believe in me." So if you're not going to believe what I say, look at how I live. "Then you will know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father." Jesus is saying so kindly, beautifully, pastorally to the people, look, if believing I'm the Son of God is a step too far for you, surely you could at least acknowledge the good I have done and believe in that. Surely you could at least say as a first step, hey, he can play the music. And for those of us who've been brought up in church, if that music imagery isn't working for you, you think about passages like Matthew chapter 7 and use this imagery. Surely, says Jesus, you can judge a tree by its fruit. Surely you can judge a prophet by his deeds. It might seem incredible to you, said Jesus to the people of the day, and I want to echo that. It might seem incredible to us to me and to you. But Jesus says, if I can do what I have done and which you have seen with your own eyes, it's only because I am God and from God and one with God. That's why I can play the music. I've been thinking about this. I went off to sleep last night thinking about this. I have probably had two major experiences in my life that I would call crises of faith. One, I was only 12 with one, and I didn't know it was a crisis of faith then. We'd had a very bad car accident as a family. And the other one was in my late 30s. And I have since that time, and I'm sure in between those two times, had those little mini crises of faith, which I'm sure many of you have. You know, do you ever just have that moment you're driving or you wake up or you're praying and you think, is God real? Please nod, somebody nod. Don't leave the pastor hanging up here as the only one who's ever thought, oh no, Simon, okay. Oh dear. I know you have, you've told me. I'll call you out if you don't nod, all right? No, I promise I won't do that. And in both those big moments, what I would identify as crises of faith, and in some of those more everyday moments, you know, the thing that gets me back to, yeah, he's real. Two things. One, I am unable to have that conversation about whether or not God is real with anyone other than God, which kind of makes me always think, that's interesting, I'm asking God if he's real. But the second thing, and it's what Jesus was saying to the people there, I realised, is I can never, and I have tried, particularly in my late 30s, I actually actively tried to jettison it. But I can never, head stuff can mess with my head, and I could understand saying, well, how can that be? Or that can't possibly be true at these times, these crisis times. But I can never get away from the fact that I have experienced and know Jesus and God's love. And I have the constant thing that I experience, and I can't even explain it to you people who are probably quite open and on my side in this matter, but I just have known him with me. When it's been crappy, as you might like, and when it's been wonderful. I have known him with me. He might not have changed circumstances, most often not, but I have known him with me. And even when I've said on one occasion, go away, he won't. He stays and he stands, and sometimes he laughs and sometimes he sobs with me. And it occurred to me that's what Jesus was saying. Okay, if it's messing with your head and you can't believe what I've said, I am the Son of God, look at me. Look at our relationship. Look at what I do. And that's the thing that brings me back again and again, the relationship that I have. I think there's something in that. Maybe there's something in that for some of you here today. I get back to that place, effectively, when I realise I can believe those other things because of this experience that I have had of God. You know, how else could he play this impossible music other than that he is the Son of God? Now, many of those of the city-based religious establishment watching and listening to Jesus at the time, they could not accept that Jesus was God with them, and they weren't prepared to look at what he was doing and how he lived his life and the effect that he was having on other people. But, interestingly, others from the country in the land beyond the Jordan River, they knew different. And they chose the Jesus life. They marveled at the music. And I want to read you a couple of verses of that while I invite the band to come back up. Once again, so Jesus had said this stuff, and once again, the people tried to arrest him. But he got away and left them. And he went beyond the Jordan River, left the city, near the place where John was first baptizing, and he stayed there for a while. And many followed him. John didn't perform miraculous signs, they remarked to one another, but everything John said about this man has come true. And those beautiful words, that final verse of the chapter, and many who were there believed in Jesus. So here we are again, back at the choice that I'm suggesting is the basic premise of this series. Thief life or Jesus life? And I want to give you a moment, ask you to take a moment to listen to the song that Jesus plays. It's a song about restored relationship with God. It's a song about more certainty in life because you live in the company of the one who is the gate and the gatekeeper. You see all of this in the verses we've read in John. That's in verse 7 to 9. It's a song about less loneliness because you live with the one whose voice you know. Verses 8, 16, 27. It's a song about less worry because you will be in the care of the one who provides. 9 to 10. Less anxiety because the good shepherd pays attention. Verse 14. Less fear because Jesus protects you even at the cost of his own life. Verses 11 to 13 and 18 in that passage. A song about ultimate security because no one and no thing, not even death, which is our ultimate thing. No one and no thing, not even death, can snatch you away from Jesus, who is one with God. And we have that that's a beautiful smile at that place. Jesus, who is one with God. We've got that in verses 25 to 30. No one takes from God what God has taken to himself. No one, no thing, not even death. Thanks, guys. You can play for us something quiet in the background there. What's your choice, I want to ask you this morning? So have you chosen the Jesus life? I know many of you have, because I know you. Maybe for some of you, and I know this to be true of some of you too, you're debating the idea that there might be a choice. Is there a choice? And I'm guessing for some of us, you need to choose the Jesus life perhaps for the first time, or maybe for many of us again and again and again, most days. And I want to suggest that wherever you sit on that, whether you say, yeah, I've chosen the Jesus life, whether you say, is it even a choice? Is it just something you religious people have made up? Or whether you say, yeah, I'm ready to choose that first time, or I've been a Christian a long while and I probably need to choose it again and get in the habit of choosing it again and again. Wherever you sit on that continuum and a whole lot of other places in between, moving from wherever you are is going to require openness and vulnerability and some intentional action. It's not going to happen by itself. So I want to ask you very deliberately and pointedly, before you get to go out for morning tea, what's one thing you can do? What's one thing you will do in this moment or on this day? You can take a week if you want, no longer. The moment goes so quickly. Go with this moment, go with this day, or in this week before we meet again on Sunday. What's one thing you can do towards reclaiming or claiming the abundant life? Maybe it is simply for you today to acknowledge that Jesus can play that nearly unplayable music, and that you can trust him as God's son and your own good shepherd. Maybe it's just that. Actually, Jesus can play the music. He is who he says he is. Or maybe you need to lean into one of those characteristics, those 6 or so characteristics I've been talking about: less anxiety, less fear, more confidence. You think, there's some stuff in there that I need to particularly pick one of those and lean into that characteristic in order to claim or reclaim the abundant life. Part of the purpose of this series that I said right at the beginning was so that for us as a church, we could consider how we might show up in the extraordinary relational spaces we already have with people in our community. And you remember in week 1, right at the beginning of the series, we recognised that choosing, or for some of us, re-choosing, reclaiming the Jesus life is going to be the first step towards showing up. Remember, we talked about choosing the Jesus life and letting go of the things that keep us from the freedom of that life. We talked about discharging loyal soldiers. We talked about learning to have more fun, holding some really important things tightly, but probably less than we do hold tightly, so that we can hold a whole pile of other things a little more lightly. So maybe for you, today is the day you need to ask the Good Shepherd to make it clear to you where he is inviting you to join him where he's already got relationship with someone in our community. maybe in your street or at your workplace. God's not sending you a place where he's not. He's inviting you to come join him where he already is. Maybe that's for you today, just to be able to say that simple prayer. So Jesus, where are you gesturing to me to come join you? So that I can show something of my relationship with you to the people that I live with. Tried to capture those 3 things up there. I'm very aware that the Spirit might have done something quite different in your head. Go with that if he has. What can or will you do out of what you've heard today?